There was a man once, just like you, maybe just like your dad, or that guy you see every morning at the diner before the sun even thinks about showing up. A man who carried more weight in his mind than he ever did on his shoulders, though his shoulders carried plenty. He walked through life with a quiet strength, the kind that's often overlooked because it doesn't shout or pound its chest. But deep down, beneath the callous skin and the steady gaze, there was a constant hum of doubt, a fear that whispered he wasn't quite enough, not yet, maybe never. And that fear, like a slow-growing vine, threatened to choke out everything he was truly capable of. That man was Wyatt, 43 years old, built like a brick wall that's seen a few winters, still solid but with the edges softened by time and gravity. He was a construction worker through and through. Not the architect in the clean shirt, not the foreman barking orders from a clipboard, but the guy on the ground, hands-on, the one who knew the weight of a beam and the bite of a cold steel wrench. His face was a roadmap of hard work, a landscape of fine lines carved by squinting into the sun and the wind, eyes that had seen 1,000 dawns break over half-built structures. They were observant eyes, always taking things in, rarely giving much away, framed by a perpetual hint of tiredness that no amount of sleep seemed to fully erase. His hands, well, they were a story in themselves. Knuckles thick and scarred, nails perpetually short and clean beneath the grime that always found its way back. They were hands that knew the feel of rough concrete, the vibration of a jackhammer, the sharp bite of sheet metal. These weren't hands that worried about manicures or soft lotions. These were working hands, instruments of a trade, strong and capable, yet often subconsciously clenched in his pockets when he was feeling the gnaw of that quiet doubt inside. Wyatt was a man of few words, preferring to listen, to observe, to let the world unfold around him before he offered a measured thought. He blended into the background, dependable as the sunrise, always there, always doing his part, often doing more than his part without ever drawing attention to it. He wore the same worn-out steel-toed boots, the same faded flannel shirts, practical and sturdy, mirroring the man inside. He wasn't flashy, didn't need to be. His strength was in his reliability, in the silent commitment he brought to every beam laid, every wall raised. But beneath that dependable surface, behind those quiet eyes, something restless stirred, a hunger for something more, a yearning for a role that felt truly his, yet perpetually held in check by the insidious voice of not good enough. They say the biggest battles ain't fought with fists or fire, but in the quiet corners of a man's own mind. A whisper of doubt can drown out the roar of 1,000 truths, holding back strength that could move mountains. There was a man like that, quiet and strong, who knew this truth deep in his bones, though he wouldn't have put it in so many words. His name was Wyatt, 43 years old, and he built things. Not just houses or offices, but the very backbone of the city, one beam, one pour, one foundation at a time. He looked like the kind of man you'd trust with the important stuff, the heavy stuff, solid as the concrete he worked with. His face was a map of weathered lines etched by sun and wind and too many early mornings. What you noticed first were his eyes, not flashy or piercing, just observant. They were observant eyes, always taking things in, rarely giving much away, framed by a permanent slight squint from years of squinting at blueprints under a relentless sun. His hands were his story, thick-knuckled and scarred, powerful hands that knew the honest weight of a sledgehammer and the delicate touch needed to set a level just so. They were the hands of a man who built the world piece by piece, but often felt like he was just a piece of the world, interchangeable with any other. Every morning began before the world was ready for it. The digital glow of his alarm clock cutting through the pre-dawn dark at 4:45 a.m., not 5:00, because an extra 15 minutes meant less traffic, meant he wasn't rushed, meant one less thing to worry about. He'd swing his legs out of bed with a soft groan, the joints complaining a little more each year, a symphony of pops and cracks accompanying his first steps. Sarah was usually a soft lump beside him, Lily and Ethan deep in their kid dreams down the hall. Those moments with the house quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator and the faint smell of last night's dinner, were his private sanctuary. He'd make his coffee, black and strong, the kind that scalded your tongue and woke up your guts. While it brewed, he'd pack his lunch. A couple of thick-cut ham sandwiches on whole wheat, an apple, maybe a banana, and his trusty thermos filled with the same dark coffee. No fancy salads or protein shakes for Wyatt, just fuel for the long haul. The ritual was etched into him, a familiar rhythm that kept the chaos of the day at bay, if only for a few minutes. Then, the drive. The skeletal frames of half-built structures would slowly appear on the horizon, growing clearer as the sun reluctantly nudged its way above the rooftops of the city. He drove the same route, saw the same early risers, the same glint of frost on car windows in winter, the same hazy shimmer of heat in summer. Another day, another site, another set of foundations to pour, beams to hoist, walls to raise. The job was honest, demanding, and utterly predictable. The controlled chaos of a construction site was his world. The clang of steel, the roar of diesel engines, the high-pitched whine of saws, the dust, always the dust, settling on everything like a fine, gritty blanket. He was good at it, damn good. Precise, dependable. The kind of man you put on the tricky stuff because you knew he wouldn't screw it up. But deep down, sometimes, as he laid another perfectly plumb beam, he felt less like a craftsman and more like a human extension of the machinery, just another tool in the box. The money, well, it was always a tightrope walk. Mortgage payments, car insurance, groceries that seemed to get pricier every week. Lily needed new glasses. Ethan was growing out of his hockey skates again. He and Sarah made it work, always did, but there wasn't much left over for anything beyond the essentials. The quiet worry of it all hummed beneath the surface of his days, a low-frequency vibration that kept him grounded but also weighed him down. He worked hard, harder than most, but the feeling of always chasing, always just making it, never quite getting ahead was a constant dull ache. It wasn't just the bills, though. That was the surface stuff. What truly haunted Wyatt wasn't out there. It was in here, behind his ribs, rattling around in the dark corners of his mind. He was a man with a mind built for strategy, for seeing how all the pieces fit, for anticipating problems before they arose. He saw things others missed, better ways to sequence a pour, safer methods to rig a lift. He had ideas, good ones, that bubbled up, sometimes even to the tip of his tongue. But then that insidious voice would kick in, a low, constant drone. What if you're wrong? What if they laugh? What if you mess it up? You're good at what you do, Wyatt. Don't rock the boat. Don't overreach. Years ago, a small miscalculation on a much smaller job, a half-inch off on a crucial measurement, had led to a minor delay and a public correction from his foreman. It was nothing, really, quickly rectified, but in Wyatt's mind, it had become a monumental failure, a permanent black mark against his competence. He'd internalized it, blown it up to a colossal blunder, and it had cemented the fear that he just wasn't good enough to be in charge, to lead, to take on that next level of responsibility he secretly craved. He dreamed of being a site manager, of orchestrating the symphony of steel and concrete, of seeing a project through from blueprint to completion, making his mark. But those dreams, like forgotten tools in a dusty shed, lay buried under layers of self-doubt and the constant fear of exposure. The quiet, observant man everyone saw was also a man paralyzed by the ghost of a hypothetical mistake, always fearing the fall before he even dared to climb. He rarely voiced his own needs or ambitions, instead burying them under the dependable routine, the physical labor, the unspoken agreement to just keep his head down and do the work. The gap between the capable, insightful man he was and the hesitant, self-deprecating man he presented to the world was a chasm he couldn't bridge. His true power, a quiet, potent force, remained coiled and dormant, choked by the vine of what if. The summer sun was relentless, baking the sprawling skeleton of the new municipal complex. It was a big job, high profile, with politicians and news crews visiting every other week, eager to see the steel and concrete rise. Wyatt had been assigned to the core team, overseeing the installation of the massive pre-stressed concrete beams for the third floor. He knew every bolt, every pour, every stress point in that section like the back of his calloused hand. His hands, usually busy with the work, were instead braced against a newly set column, feeling the subtle vibrations of the crane overhead, lifting another monstrous beam into place. That afternoon, the air felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension, more than just the usual humid heat. Wyatt had just finished marking a ledger for a new section of rebar when his eyes, always scanning, always observing, caught something. A hairline fracture. On a critical load-bearing pillar, freshly cured concrete, one of the main supports for the entire east wing. It wasn't a surface scratch. It was deep, jagged, a dark vein spreading across the smooth gray like a spiderweb after a bad punch. His stomach dropped like a concrete block tossed from the 12th story. "Hold that crane!" he yelled, his voice rougher than usual, cutting through the din of grinding metal and distant hammers. He didn't wait for permission. He moved, his boots slapping hard on the dusty concrete, making a beeline for the crack. Up close, it was worse. The crack wasn't static. It was breathing, stretching, a slow, terrifying yawn opening wider right before his eyes. A fine grit of concrete dust was sifting down from it, like tiny grains of sand from a breaking hourglass. This wasn't a repair job, this was a goddamn emergency. Panic began to ripple through the crew as others spotted it. Whispers turned to shouts. "Jesus, look at that! Is that new? Gary, where's Gary?" The foreman, Gary, was nowhere to be found, stuck in a traffic jam across town, his phone ringing unanswered in the chaos. The crane operator, a young guy named Leo, had frozen, the massive beam suspended precariously in the air. Time stretched thick and slow like tar. Everyone was looking, waiting, hoping someone else would step up. They looked at Wyatt. His mind, usually a tangle of doubt, went suddenly terrifyingly clear. There was no room for what if now. There was only what is, and what needs to be done. His heart was hammering a drumbeat against his ribs, a wild bird trapped in his chest. But his hands, his eyes, his feet, they just moved. His strength, his resilience, his practical problem-solving skills, long buried under layers of self-deprecation, clawed their way to the surface. He wasn't thinking about being good enough. He was thinking about the 18 men on that floor, the 200 tons of concrete and steel above their heads, and the families waiting for them at home. "Leo, lower that beam slowly back to the ground. Get it clear of the perimeter. Everyone off this floor now. No running, just move. 2 men to reroute traffic away from the east side of the building immediately. Dave, get on the horn with the engineers, tell them what we got, tell them to get down here now." His voice, usually quiet, had a new edge to it, an unfamiliar certainty that cut through the rising panic. He didn't shout, but every word landed with the weight of steel. He didn't question himself. He just acted. It was raw, instinctive, born of a deep-seated knowledge of how these things worked, how they broke, and how to keep people safe. He was making decisions that could cost millions, decisions that could save lives, and he was doing it on pure adrenaline and years of quiet observation. It felt like walking a tightrope across a canyon, the wind screaming in his ears, but somehow his feet just knew where to go. That night, 3 a.m., Wyatt lay awake. Sarah was a warm, soft presence beside him, her breathing slow and steady. The house was utterly silent, save for the distant hum of the refrigerator. He felt exhausted, wrung out, but his mind wouldn't switch off. The image of that crack, that spreading fissure, was burned into his eyelids. He could still feel the subtle vibration of the concrete dust falling, the thrum of the crane, the rising panic in the crew's eyes. He'd done it. He'd taken charge. He'd made the calls, and for now, everyone was safe. The engineers had arrived, pale and frantic, confirming his assessment. It was a critical failure, caught just in time. The east wing was shut down, a massive delay, a massive cost, but no one had been hurt. He should have felt relief, maybe even pride. But all he felt was a sickening emptiness, a cold knot of dread deep in his gut. His mind replayed every decision, every shouted command, every second of that horrifying afternoon. Had he been too fast? Too slow? Should he have waited for Gary, knowing what he knew about the structural integrity? Had he overstepped? The familiar demons began their insidious work, whispering doubts into the quiet of the night. "You got lucky, Wyatt. Anyone could have done that. You're no leader. You just reacted. What if you make a mistake next time? A real mistake?" He stared up at the ceiling, his small, modest bedroom suddenly feeling like a cage. What had his life become? A cycle of work, bills, and the constant gnawing fear of not being enough. He'd always pushed down the desire for more, told himself it wasn't for him, that he was happier in the background, a dependable cog in the machine. He'd buried his dreams of leadership, of taking ownership, under layers of self-doubt and the constant worry of exposing his perceived weaknesses. Tonight, that quiet competence, that raw, powerful instinct had burst through. He had seen the chasm between the capable man he was and the hesitant man he presented to the world, and for a few terrifying hours he'd been forced to bridge it. And now, lying here in the dark, the bridge felt like it was collapsing. He felt exposed, vulnerable. The praise from the engineers, the hushed respect from the crew, it all felt like a spotlight on his deepest fear. That he would eventually be found out, that his quiet confidence was just a fluke, and that the next time he would fail catastrophically. He internalized it all, the stress and anxiety twisting into a hard ball in his chest. His dreams, so carefully suppressed, felt closer than ever, and yet further away, shrouded in the terrifying light of this new, unwelcome responsibility. He was shaking, not from cold, but from a profound, raw fear that had finally broken free. The shake wasn't from cold, but from a profound, raw fear that had finally broken free. It was the kind of fear that follows you home, wraps its icy fingers around your throat just when you think you've escaped. The kind that tells you, even after you've done something truly difficult, that you're still not good enough. But before the fear, there had been the project. A new high-rise going up downtown, 12 floors of steel and concrete, pushing the skyline a little higher. It was a Monday, the kind that started with a damp chill that seeped into your bones, promising rain but delivering only a heavier dampness in the air. They were already behind schedule, everyone on edge. Wyatt was on the 6th floor, his crew a quiet rhythm of clanging metal and low voices, setting rebar for the next pour. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with an unconscious efficiency honed over decades. He felt the subtle vibrations of the building, the hum of activity, knew the structure like a second skin. Then the radio crackled, urgent, strained. "Wyatt, get to Sector D, Level 4. Now." The voice belonged to Mikey, the new safety officer, usually too green to raise his voice above a murmur. Wyatt felt a knot tighten in his gut. That wasn't good. He dropped his wrench, nodded to his foreman, and took off, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete stairs as he descended, 2 steps at a time. Each landing brought a fresh jolt of adrenaline. When he reached Level 4, Sector D, the scene hit him like a physical blow. A newly poured, critical load-bearing column, still curring, had a spiderweb of cracks spreading from its base, deep fissures that shouldn't be there. Not settlement cracks, these looked structural, dangerous. The formwork, usually solid, had shifted, subtle but enough to compromise the integrity of the pour. The concrete was failing. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, illuminating the grave danger. A few workers stood frozen, their faces pale, staring at the crumbling pillar. Mikey, the safety officer, was ghost-white, babbling into his radio, clearly overwhelmed. The foreman for that section was there too, eyes wide, looking at Wyatt, desperate for an answer, for a lead. But there was no lead. The site manager, Ted, had called in sick with some stomach bug, stuck at home, miles away. He was unreachable. There was no one else, just Wyatt. The full weight of the situation landed on him like a 100-pound sack of cement. This wasn't just a deadline issue, it was a safety issue. If that column failed, it could trigger a progressive collapse, bringing down a section of the entire building. People could die, his crew. For a split second, that familiar paralysis threatened to take hold. What if I'm wrong? What if I make it worse? The words echoed in his head, a lifetime of self-doubt screaming for him to step back, to defer, to wait for someone else. But there was no one else. Then something shifted. A quiet clarity cut through the noise, through the fear. It wasn't a loud declaration or a surge of bravado. It was a deep, guttural understanding that came from years of sweat and dirt, from countless hours spent looking at blueprints, feeling concrete, trusting the integrity of materials. He saw the problem not just as a disaster, but as a puzzle. He knew what had gone wrong. He knew what had to be done. "All right," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, cutting through Mikey's frantic radio chatter. "Clear this section. Everyone out now." His eyes locked with the foreman S. "Get shoring beams down here, double time. We need to brace that column, distribute the load immediately." He pointed to a specific point on the floor. "And tell the concrete crew we need emergency slurry mix, quick setting. We're gonna try to inject and reinforce, then rebuild the formwork." He moved decisively, checking the adjacent structure, his mind racing through calculations he'd learned by doing, not just by reading. He directed the placement of the shoring, barked orders with a calm authority he didn't know he possessed, his hands already on a laser level, his eyes scanning for any other weaknesses. The crew, seeing his quiet, unhesitating command, snapped into action. They followed him not because he was the loudest, but because he was the one who knew. They worked for 3 frantic hours, sweat plastering their shirts to their backs, the air thick with tension and the smell of fresh concrete. Wyatt was everywhere, directing, assisting, double-checking, his fear temporarily pushed aside by the sheer force of necessity and the quiet hum of his own competence. By the time the immediate danger was averted, the column braced, reinforced, and secured, a collective sigh of relief swept through the site. Engineers who had finally arrived looked at him with a new respect. The crew, tired but safe, murmured their appreciation. But that was today. Now lying in his bed in the suffocating dark, the memory of his calm competence felt distant, alien even, replaced by that familiar, suffocating dread. The praise, the hushed respect, it all felt like a spotlight on his deepest fear. He saw the chasm between the capable man he had been on the site today and the hesitant man he presented to the world, and for a few terrifying hours he'd been forced to bridge it. And now, lying here in the dark, the bridge felt like it was collapsing. He felt exposed, vulnerable. That quiet confidence felt like a fluke, a lucky shot. He was certain that he would eventually be found out, that the next time he would fail catastrophically. The stress and anxiety from the day twisted into a hard, aching ball in his chest. His dreams of leadership, of taking ownership, so carefully suppressed, felt closer than ever, and yet further away, shrouded in the terrifying light of this new, unwelcome responsibility. He was shaking not from cold, but from a profound, raw fear that had finally broken free, a fear that told him, despite everything, he was still just Wyatt. Just Wyatt. That night, the clock hands dragged themselves toward morning, each tick a hammer blow against Wyatt's skull. The air in the room felt heavy, thick with the unsaid, with the constant, grinding anxiety that had become his oldest companion. He thrashed for a while, tangled in the sheets, trying to escape the vice grip of his own thoughts. Sarah murmured something in her sleep beside him, a soft, oblivious sound that only intensified his isolation. He pictured Lily and Ethan, sleeping soundly in their own rooms, their futures a bright, open road he was supposed to pave, protect. And here he was, staring down a future where he was nothing more than a man paralyzed by the ghost of failure. He imagined the next day, the next week, the endless parade of responsibilities he'd have to duck, the promotions he'd quietly let slide past him, the opportunities he'd pretend not to see. He saw himself, years from now, still the quiet, dependable guy, still good enough to get the job done, but never good enough to lead it, never brave enough to reach for something more. The thought was a cold, hard stone in his gut. The fear of being found out, of failing, was so consuming, it was making him fail already in his own mind before he even tried. He was building walls around himself, higher and higher, not to keep others out, but to keep himself in, trapped. He rolled onto his back, arms flung wide, staring at the darkened ceiling as if it held all the answers. The silence of the house pressed in, amplifying the frantic rhythm of his own heart. He thought of his dad, a man who'd faced down layoffs and recessions with a stoic shrug and a relentless work ethic. His dad hadn't worried about being good enough. He just was. He'd shown up day after day and done what needed to be done, no fuss, no drama, just a quiet, unyielding presence. Wyatt felt a pang of shame, a deep-seated embarrassment that he, a grown man, a father, was so crippled by these invisible chains. Then a whisper, not from outside, but from somewhere deep within, a voice so quiet he almost missed it, a voice that had been buried under layers of self-doubt for years. Enough. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It was just a quiet, firm enough. Enough of the fear, enough of the hiding, enough of letting the what-ifs dictate his life. It wasn't an instruction, not yet, just a statement of fact. This wasn't working. He couldn't go on like this. He didn't know how to stop, or what came next, but the current path, the constant dance with dread that had to end. The profound weariness that settled over him wasn't just physical. It was a spiritual exhaustion from fighting himself for so long. He closed his eyes, not for sleep, but for a moment of surrender. He didn't have all the answers, not a single one, really, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a faint flicker of something else beneath the fear. A desperate, urgent need to find a different way. He had to try. He just had to. The next morning, the alarm blared at 5 a.m., a rude interruption to the uneasy truce he'd forged with himself. The exhaustion from his sleepless night was a heavy cloak. Every muscle in his body ached, and his eyelids felt weighted with lead. He wanted nothing more than to pull the blanket over his head and disappear into the oblivion of sleep, to postpone the inevitable return to the construction site where yesterday's emergency still felt raw. He imagined the scrutiny, the questions, the unspoken expectations now resting on his shoulders. That familiar knot of anxiety began to tighten in his stomach. "You okay, hun?" Sarah's voice, soft and sleepy from the kitchen, cut through his haze. Grunted in response, a non-committal sound, and dragged himself out of bed. The decision of the night before, that quiet, "Enough!" felt fragile in the cold light of day, like a half-forgotten dream. It was just a feeling, a fleeting moment of resolve, not a shield against the real world. He went through the motions of breakfast, coffee bitter, toast tasteless. Lily and Ethan chattered about school, oblivious, and he found himself watching them, trying to draw strength from their unburdened energy. Thought about that whisper enough, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that if he just went back to being the old Wyatt, the one who kept his head down and his mouth shut, that whisper would grow into a scream he could never silence. Walking onto the site was like stepping into a cold shower. The air still carried the faint smell of fresh concrete and disturbed earth. Supervisor Dave, a burly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, was already barking orders, setting the tone for the day. Wyatt's usual instinct was to blend into the crowd, to find his task and quietly execute it, avoiding eye contact, keeping his thoughts to himself. Today, though, felt different. He walked past the partially repaired column, the temporary bracing still stark against the raw concrete. He knew intimately every angle, every weakness, every stress point of that structure. He saw a crew struggling to position a new steel plate, a bit off-kilter, and a wave of frustration mixed with that familiar self-doubt washed over him. His mind, trained by decades of hands-on experience, instantly saw a better, safer way to angle the crane, a simple adjustment that would prevent a tricky relift. His heart hammered against his ribs. The old Wyatt would have just walked past, maybe muttered a silent curse about inefficiency. But that quiet, "Enough," echoed. This wasn't about seeking glory. It was about doing the job right, about preventing another close call, about trusting what he knew. His mouth felt dry. His voice, when he tried to speak, felt stuck in his throat. He almost faltered, almost decided it wasn't worth the potential awkwardness, the possibility of being dismissed, or worse, being told he was wrong. But then he remembered the image of Lily and Ethan and the profound exhaustion of constantly fighting himself. He couldn't keep doing this. He took a deep breath, pushing past the burning in his chest. "Dave!" He called out, his voice raspy, a little louder than he intended. Dave turned, a look of mild irritation on his face. Wyatt pointed to the crane, then to the plate. "If you shift that boom just 3 degrees to the west and lower the tag line on the south side, it'll seat clean the first time. Save yourself 20 minutes and a relift." The words tumbled out, practical, precise, backed by pure, unadulterated knowledge. He wasn't arrogant, he was simply stating a fact gleaned from experience. Dave squinted, then looked from Wyatt to the crane. He thought about it for a second, then nodded curtly. "All right, Wyatt, give it a shot." A shot, that was it. No fanfare, no applause, just a simple acceptance. But for Wyatt, it was like the world had shifted on its axis. He walked over to the crane operator, explaining the adjustment calmly, confidently. The operator, a gruff veteran named Mike, listened, nodded, and made the change. Moments later, the heavy steel plate settled into place with a satisfying thud, perfectly aligned. Mike gave Wyatt a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. Dave just grunted and moved on, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, respect perhaps, or at least a recognition of competence. Wyatt didn't feel a rush of pride, not really. What he felt was a profound sense of calm, a quiet certainty that he had simply done what needed to be done. He hadn't sought approval, he had acted on his knowledge. And in that tiny, almost imperceptible act, a sliver of the fear that had plagued him for so long loosened its grip. It was just one small step, barely a ripple, but for Wyatt it was a tidal wave. He had spoken and the sky hadn't fallen. In fact, things had actually gotten a little bit easier. The satisfaction from the crane lift didn't last long enough to make it to lunch. By the time the thermos was empty and the hard hats were back on, the old whispers were already seeping back in like water finding cracks in a foundation. "Beginner's luck, Wyatt. Dave just humored you. Don't get too big for your britches." They weren't loud, those voices, but they were persistent, a dull ache behind his eyes. He saw a new guy, fresh out of trade school, trying to force a bolt into a misaligned hole, stripping the threads with every grunt. Wyatt knew the trick, a slight tap with a specific hammer, a shim you could cut from scrap steel. The words formed on his tongue, ready to offer help, to prevent a delay that would cost time and material. But then the memory of old laughs, the dismissive hand waves from past foremen when he had dared to speak up, they choked the words. He swallowed, kept his head down, and moved onto his own task, the sound of the grinding bolt a small, sour note in the rhythm of his day. The pit in his stomach was back. It felt like he'd taken 1 step forward and 2 back, all in the space of an hour. That night the house was quiet. Sarah was reading in bed, Lily was absorbed in her phone, and Ethan was long asleep. Wyatt sat at the kitchen table, a half-empty mug of cold coffee in front of him. He stared at a spreadsheet of figures: the mortgage, the car payment, Lily's braces fund, Ethan's soccer cleats. Every number felt heavy, etched in concrete. He knew there was a better way, a promotion, more responsibility, more pay. The construction crew was shorthanded for skilled leads, and he was skilled. But the thought of putting himself out there, of having to prove it day in and day out, of making a mistake that actually mattered, the air grew thick with unspoken dread. He pushed the spreadsheet away, the numbers blurring. What was the point of knowing what to do if you couldn't actually do it? If the fear kept you chained to the same spot year after year? The next week was a blur of steel and dust, a constant internal argument. There were moments, small opportunities, where Wyatt's experience could have smoothed things over, saved a few minutes, prevented a minor snag. He'd feel the urge, the quiet conviction, but then the paralysis would set in. A foreman, a burly man named Gus who was known for his bark, snapped at a younger worker for a trivial error. Wyatt saw a more efficient way to fix it, one that wouldn't involve yelling. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Gus just rolled his eyes at the kid, then fixed it the hard way, grumbling. Wyatt felt a familiar flush of shame. He was just a pair of hands, he told himself. That's what he was good for. Just keep moving, keep your head down. Then came Thursday. A critical beam, a main support for the third floor, was being hoisted. The plan was detailed, rehearsed, but the ground was soft from an overnight rain, and one of the outrigger pads on the crane was sinking ever so slightly. Wyatt, from his vantage point, saw it. He saw the subtle tilt in the crane's boom, the almost imperceptible shift in the beam's trajectory. His gut clenched. This wasn't a stripped bolt, this was serious. He saw the site manager, Dave, distracted, checking plans on a tablet, oblivious. Panic seized Wyatt, cold and sharp. His heart hammered. He had to say something. His mind raced, cataloging the potential catastrophic outcomes. But then the old script played. What if you're wrong? What if you look stupid? What if you cause a panic for nothing? The seconds stretched, agonizing. He opened his mouth, a guttural sound escaping, but the words wouldn't form. He looked around wildly, trying to catch someone's eye, anyone's. But everyone was focused on their own part of the lift. And then it happened. Not a collapse, not a catastrophe, but a lurch. A sharp, sickening groan from the crane, a shout from the operator, and the massive steel beam swung wide, scraping against the partially erected concrete column, sending a shower of sparks and a loud, grating shriek through the air. Everyone froze. The crane operator, Mike, quickly lowered the beam, the entire operation now off-kilter. Dave, alerted by the noise, spun around, his face white. What the hell happened? He roared, looking at the crane, then at the damaged column. Wyatt stood there, rooted to the spot, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He knew. He had seen it coming. He could have prevented it. He felt the weight of that missed opportunity, the metallic tang of failure in his mouth. The anger at himself was a hot, searing flame. He hadn't just kept his head down, he had actively contributed to the problem by his silence. The small scratch on the column, while not structurally critical, would need repair, costing time and money. More importantly, it had been a close call. Too close. The rest of the day, Wyatt was a ghost. He moved through his tasks mechanically, his mind replaying the lurch, the scraping sound, his own choked silence. The confidence he'd felt just days before, that quiet certainty, it was shattered, lying in pieces around him. The whispers were no longer whispers, they were shouts now. You're a coward, Wyatt. You're a fraud. You don't belong here. He wanted to walk off the job right then and there. Go home, tell Sarah he was done with construction, that he was going to find something, anything, where his decisions wouldn't matter, where his silence couldn't hurt anyone. The thought of facing another day like this, another moment where he knew what to do but was paralyzed by fear, was unbearable. He wanted to quit. He truly, deeply wanted to just disappear. But then he thought of Lily's braces, Ethan's soccer, Sarah's tired smile after a long day at her own job. He couldn't. Not yet. He just had to find a way to carry this weight, this failure, and keep moving. He was good at that, carrying things. It was all he seemed to know. The next morning, the same tired alarm sliced through the quiet of his small bedroom at 5 a.m. Wyatt lay there, staring at the ceiling, the concrete dust from yesterday still clinging to his lungs, the shame clinging to his soul. He didn't want to move. Every bone in his body screamed against facing another day, another moment where he'd have to choose between speaking up and retreating into the suffocating comfort of silence. But then he pictured Lily's face, etched with the anticipation of her upcoming school play, Ethan's missing front tooth, Sarah's hand reaching for his across the kitchen table just last night, a silent anchor in his storm. He couldn't quit. Not yet. He just had to find a way to carry this weight, this failure, and keep moving. He was good at that, carrying things. It was all he seemed to know. He dragged himself through the motions of breakfast, packed his lunch, kissed Sarah and the sleeping children, and drove to the site. The air was colder, the sky grayer, mirroring the landscape of his mind. He pulled on his hard hat, his gloves, the familiar tools weighing down his belt, each one a reminder of the job he felt increasingly unfit for. Mid-morning, while hauling rebar, he heard the frantic shout of a new guy fresh out of trade school, trying to wrangle a section of pipe into place. The young man was struggling, his leverage all wrong, and Wyatt could see from 20 yards away that the pipe was about to slip, potentially cracking a freshly poured section of foundation if it dropped. His gut clenched. The memory of the column, the scratch, the silence that led to it, flashed through his mind like a lightning strike. No, not again. Before he could overthink it, before the familiar paralysis could set in, his feet moved. He dropped the rebar, walked swiftly but calmly to the young worker, and without a word reached out, grabbed the pipe with a practiced grip, and shifted his weight. "Hold it steady, son," he grunted, his voice rough but even. With a smooth, coordinated movement, they guided the heavy pipe into its slot. The young man looked at Wyatt, eyes wide with a mixture of relief and awe. "Thanks, Mr. Wyatt. I almost messed that up." Wyatt just nodded, his gaze already scanning the surrounding work, identifying potential hazards before they became problems. He didn't feel heroic, he just felt like he'd done what needed to be done. A small, almost imperceptible tremor of something akin to quiet satisfaction ran through him. He hadn't thought about it, he just acted. Over the next few weeks, that small moment began to multiply. The internal battle was still fierce. The whispers of inadequacy still tried to claw their way back in, especially when he was tired or alone in the truck on the way home. But now, Wyatt had ammunition. Each time he spoke up about a safety concern, each time he pointed out a potential structural flaw to a foreman who'd overlooked it, each time he offered a quiet, practical solution to a problem that had others scratching their heads, he built a tiny counterargument against the doubt. He wasn't loud. He didn't thump his chest or demand attention. He just did. He didn't offer grand speeches. He offered precise observations and hands-on demonstrations. He found himself walking the site with a new kind of awareness, not just of his own tasks, but of the entire complex ecosystem of the build. He'd see a loose cable that could snag, an uneven scaffold plank, a worker struggling with a task that could be done safer, faster, with a simple adjustment. And instead of wrestling with the fear of speaking, he'd just speak. His voice was still quiet, but now it carried a new weight, a resonance that came from certainty, not volume. Others started to notice. Foremen, initially surprised by his newfound assertiveness, began to seek him out. "Wyatt, got a minute? You got an eye for these things." Younger guys, like the one with the pipe, started watching him, learning from his methodical approach, his calm assessment of problems. They didn't see a flashy leader. They saw a bedrock of competence, a man whose hands knew the material and whose mind understood the structure. Wyatt, for his part, still felt the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach before he spoke, before he stepped forward. But it was different now. It was no longer a paralyzing terror, but a sharp awareness, a signal to pay closer attention, to be even more precise. He was learning that being scared wasn't the problem. Letting the fear dictate his actions was. The quiet confidence he'd glimpsed, then lost, now began to rebuild itself, brick by painstaking brick. It wasn't a roar, but a steady hum, like the well-tuned engine of a machine that simply worked. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The rhythm of the job, which once felt like a monotonous grind, now held a new depth. Wyatt still showed up at 5 a.m., still packed his modest lunch, still came home tired. But the tiredness was different. It was the exhaustion of a man who had done something, truly contributed, not just pushed through another day. One blustery Tuesday, with a major concrete pour scheduled for the next morning, the project hit a snag that sent tremors through the entire crew. The structural engineer's plans, crucial for the complex roof truss system, were found to have a critical miscalculation. A load-bearing beam was undersized. The site manager, a man usually unflappable, was pacing, shouting into his phone, the deadline looming like a hungry beast. The entire pour and days of work hung in the balance. Wyatt watched the unfolding chaos. He saw the panic in the eyes of his colleagues, felt the familiar prickle of apprehension in his own chest. But this time, it wasn't a retreat. He walked over to the distressed site manager, not with an apology for interrupting, but with purpose. "Mark," he said, his voice cutting through the manager's agitated phone call, "the beam's undersized, sure, but we've got a couple options here. If we reroute the load to the secondary supports by adding a steel plate and reinforcing the adjacent joists, we can carry the extra weight. It'll mean a few hours fabricating on-site, but it's faster than reordering a new beam, and it'll hold." Mark looked at Wyatt, his eyes still wide with stress, but now also with a glimmer of disbelief, then dawning recognition. "Wyatt, where did you sure about this?" Wyatt didn't waver. He pointed to a section of the blueprint, his finger tracing lines he'd studied for years. "Saw a similar problem on the old courthouse job, 8. It's unconventional, but it's sound. I can lead a crew to get it done tonight." He wasn't boasting. He wasn't even confident in the traditional sense, that loud, almost aggressive kind of assurance. He was simply stating facts, offering a solution born from years of hands-on experience and a newfound trust in his own ability to see beyond the immediate problem. He was still Wyatt, the quiet man, but the fear that once silenced him had receded. replaced by a deep-seated knowledge that, when called upon, simply knew what to do. That night, under floodlights, Wyatt led a small team. He didn't bark orders, but calmly explained each step, his hands guiding, his eyes constantly assessing. He worked alongside them, welding, grinding, reinforcing, the clang of metal echoing his quiet determination. By dawn, the modification was complete, solid, and true. The concrete pour went ahead as planned. The next day, Mark pulled Wyatt aside. "Wyatt," he said, his voice thick with gratitude, "you saved us. You really did." He paused, looking at Wyatt with new eyes. "I've seen you around for years, steady as a rock, but something's different. You're leading now, not just working. I think it's time we talked about you stepping up. Lead foreman, maybe even a site supervisor when this project wraps." Wyatt met his gaze. He still felt the tremor of vulnerability, the memory of his past self. But beneath it, a quiet strength had solidified. He nodded slowly, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. "I'm ready, Mark. I think I finally am." His voice was still quiet, but it held the unshakable ring of a man who had faced his demons, not with a shout, but with a quiet, unwavering truth. He wasn't afraid anymore of not being good enough. He simply was. That conversation with Mark, it didn't just open a door. It felt like it finally let all the accumulated pressure out of a boiler that had been building for years. Wyatt didn't change overnight into a different man, no. He was still Wyatt, the same steady hand and quiet presence. But the quality of his quietness was different now. Before, it was the quiet of hesitation, of holding back. Now it was the quiet of calm certainty. The crew felt it first. When a new challenge arose, he didn't just observe. He offered solutions with a clarity that cut through the usual site chatter. He'd point to a sequence of steps, or a specific brace, or a way to rig a lift, and his words, few as they were, carried the weight of a man who simply knew. There was no bluster, no need for validation in his voice. He just spoke the truth of the job, and it resonated. Younger guys who used to approach him with trepidation now sought his eye for confirmation, for guidance. And Wyatt, instead of shying away, met their gazes squarely, offering advice or a steadying hand on a shoulder. He'd come home now, and the heavy burden he used to carry, invisible to everyone but Sarah, seemed lighter. He wasn't bringing the worry home in his shoulders anymore. He'd still be tired, yes, bone-deep tired from a day's honest work, but it was a good tired, not the draining fatigue of internal struggle. Sarah noticed. Lily and Ethan noticed. He'd sit at the dinner table, listen to their day, truly listen without his mind running through worst-case scenarios for tomorrow's pour. He'd laugh, a full, warm laugh that used to be rare. Sometimes Lily would ask him about the job, and he'd describe the solutions he'd found, the problems he'd navigated, not boasting, but with a quiet satisfaction that was infectious. Weeks later, the project wrapped ahead of schedule and under budget, a testament to the efficient problem-solving that had become the norm under Wyatt's influence. Mark made good on his word. Wyatt officially stepped into a site supervisor role, overseeing his own crew, his own schedule, his own challenges. The first few days in that new role, the old fear tried to creep back in, a faint whisper of doubt. Could he really lead? What if he messed up? But then he'd feel the solid ground beneath his feet, the familiar weight of his tools at his side, and the quiet voice inside him would surface. "You know this, Wyatt. Just do what you know." And he would. He'd stand on a muddy construction site, the wind whipping around him, a dozen men looking to him for direction, and he wouldn't feel the paralyzing fear. He'd feel the surge of practical knowledge, the quiet hum of his brain processing angles, loads, sequences. He'd see the whole picture, the solution already forming, just waiting for him to articulate it. He'd make a decision, not with a flourish, but with a calm, deliberate tone, and the crew would move, trusting his judgment without question. He was the same man, still a man of few words, still more inclined to listen than to speak. But the words he did speak now carried a different kind of power. They carried conviction. One evening, sitting on his porch swing with Sarah, watching the last light fade from the sky, he finally put words to it. "You know," he started, a rarity for him to initiate such a deep conversation. "All these years I thought I had to be somebody else to be good enough. Louder, flashier, more. Confident, I guess." He paused, looking out at the familiar street, the quiet hum of the neighborhood. "But turns out all that noise in my head, all that doubt, it was just drowning out the truth of what I already knew, the truth of what I could already do." He turned to Sarah, a gentle smile on his face. "I was always capable, always had it in me. I just never gave myself permission to trust it, never listened to that quiet voice that just knew." He shook his head slightly, a profound realization settling deep within him. "Turns out you don't gotta be the loudest guy in the room to get things done. Most times, it's the quiet voice inside, the one that knows what to do even when you're shacking. That's the one that